Well, welcome to another episode of the Residential Developer Podcast. I'm the host, Nathan Battishall, and this month we're focusing on the new low to mid-rise reforms and policy that was announced on the 28th of February 2025. It's one of the most exciting planning reforms that's definitely happened in my career and in my generation and my time in the planning and design and industry and development industry. I think it's a really prime time, especially off the back of some tricky a couple of years, I guess you'd say, just around interest rates, inflation, I guess the cost of building and that side of things. So I think it's an exciting time to really put a bit of a kick back into the property industry in Australia, especially in New South Wales. So it's exciting. And what I want to do in this episode today, last week I broke down what the reforms mean for doing projects and developments in the space of duplex and dual occupancy. Today what I want to do is I want to focus on what the reforms mean for townhouses. Now, I'm not going to go into terraces and multi-dwelling today. I've got some exciting episodes coming up where I'm going to talk about terraces, and I'm also going to be talking about manor houses, which can be done under CDC and DA under this new reform. Same thing with terraces. I'm going to break those down in some future episodes, but I want to focus on multi-dwelling today in this space of the low to mid-rise reform. Now, if you haven't seen the last couple of weeks' previous episodes, I encourage you, off the back of listening to this one, go back and listen to last week on the dual occupancies, and then go and listen to a couple of weeks prior where we actually break down the entire reform, the entire new reform that was announced, the stage 2, the non-discretionary standards that have now come into effect for dual occupancy, for multi-dwelling, for terraces, and also for units upwards of 6 stories across well-located areas in New South Wales. That's where I break down areas where you can and can't do this development. We talk about the zonings. We talk about all of those type of elements. But for time's sake today, I want to encourage you, go back and listen to those episodes. This whole month is really about equipping you under this new code, under this new legislation, because for me, investors and developers and people wanting to do residential projects to generate wealth are always at the cutting edge. People that are wanting to look for an edge or look for an opportunity. And I always believe it's always the early adopters that do the best, because a lot of the market doesn't understand what can be done. A lot of vendors don't understand what can be done. Even a lot of councils don't realise yet what can be done. A lot of real estate agents, most importantly, don't fully realise what can be done, and it's an opportunity to see gold where others may just see, they may just see dual occupancy. All of a sudden you can see further potential. You might be able to see 3, 4, 5, even 6 townhouses on sites that were not necessarily possible in the past. So the exciting thing is now this new code has opened up the ability to do townhouses and multi-dwelling developments within R1, R2 and R3 zones. Now, a lot of councils have allowed multi-dwelling, especially in R1 or R3 areas in the past, but the exciting thing is now it's opened up the ability to do multi-dwelling development in R2 zoned areas. Look, in some areas that's been possible in the past, but a lot of areas it hasn't. So it's opened up a whole new scope of locations in these well-located areas that are within 800 metres of a train station or a local centre that are deemed within that within the state government's mapping system that they've built. So it's an exciting opportunity to find sites that you could possibly get more yield on those blocks. So just before we dive right into it, I want to go through a couple of the non-discretionary standards that were introduced into the SEP a couple of days after the 28th of Feb when this announcement was made. It took a few days for the actual policy to go into the actual SEP, into the State Environmental Planning Policy, the 2021 Housing SEP. We now see these non-discretionary standards are embedded. And I know I've mentioned this in the last few previous episodes, but the beauty is these particular standards, these non-discretionary standards that sit within the SEP, are, in terms of a hierarchy, they sit above council's local environment plan and above council's development control plan. So these, if they counteract each other, this policy sits above council's policy. So council can't reject a DA. They can reject a DA on other merits, but they can't reject a DA on these particular grounds because these grounds make it permissible and possible. So the minimum lot size across all of these locations, well-located areas, whether it be R1, R2, R3 zoned areas, is the minimum lot size is 600 square metres and a 12-metre frontage, which is unbelievable. The 12-metre frontage, I couldn't believe that when I saw it. Another good one is the FSR, so it's a 0.7 to 1, so 70% of the site can be utilised for your floor space ratio, which is terrific, especially in an R2 low-density area. Height limit, 9.5 metres, so essentially gives you 2 stories. But a lot of councils currently, in especially R2 zoned areas, predominantly in New South Wales, you'll see an 8.5 or a 9 metre height limit. So 9.5 is terrific. Just gives you the ability to possibly have higher ceilings in living areas, which makes the house more livable. It gives opportunity for maybe a more traditional pitched roof rather than a flat roof, which can be great, terrific for thermal purposes as well, but also visual purposes and to fit, especially in some of the more established areas, to really fit within the streetscape. If an area predominantly is very Victorian or has a lot of pitched roofs, just having a flat roof sometimes doesn't fit well. So it gives opportunity for good design, good streetscape and amenity now. And the other big one is car parking, 1 space per dwelling, which is huge because a lot of council DCPs often require, especially if it's a 3-bedroom or more or 4-bedroom townhouse, often you may require two car spaces or parking or double garages for townhouses. Obviously, they've deemed, and, you know, people can look at it and say, oh, that's not a good thing because we're going to have more congestion. But obviously, they've only introduced this code and policy into what they've deemed well-located areas where there is good access to public transport, i.e. train stations, and also areas that are within very close proximity to local centres where a lot of people tend to work, a lot of people tend to walk, to socialise, to shop, all that side of things. So the idea is that there will be a population of people who possibly prefer to walk, may just have one family vehicle rather than a lot of families that may have 2. So they're looking at obviously creating some diversity. So I think it's a really good control. So those particular key constraints are lot size, 600 square metres, 12-metre frontage, 70% floor space ratio, 9.5 metre height limit, 1 car parking space. So these standards now are implemented into the state planning policy. As a result of them now going into the state planning policy, they override council's LEP. For example, the council's LEP might say the height limit is 8.5 metres. Well, if it's in a well-located area now, the 9.5 overrides the 8.5. If that particular council says in R2 zoned areas the floor space ratio is 50%, well, that 70% now overrides whatever council's LEP control around FSR is. If the council's DCP says townhouses have to have 2 car parks, which some of them do, the reality is now this SEP will override that part of council's DCP. If the council has a minimum lot size of 900 square metres or 800 square metres for multi-dwelling development for 3 or more dwellings, multi-dwellings, this 600 square metre, provided it's in a well-located area, this 600 square metres now overrides that part of the policy. And then a lot of councils have controls around widths of blocks. For example, some councils have a 15-metre width, some have 20. Kiama Council, 25, for example. Wollongong, 18. Then you get other councils that don't have particular widths. This new policy, if it's in a well-located area, overrides council's development control plan for the width of a block. Some even have it implemented in the LEP, but this SEP actually overrides that. And look, like I said last week, in last week's episode around dual occupancy, just because you can do a multi-dwelling on one of these well-located blocks doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be possible. There's a lot of constraints. There's a lot of things you need to look at when doing a multi-dwelling development. There 5 or 6 different controls now, exciting controls that give us opportunity to do a whole lot more development. I spoke last week and we spoke a couple of weeks ago with Will from PropCode about the fact that that PropCode's done this analysis. They've identified about 120,000 new sites that have opened up in these well-located areas to do developments from dual occupancy to multi-dwelling to small unit-based developments as a result of this reform. But there's still a lot of council controls that you need to follow, traditional controls that you will need to follow in order to carry out a development. See, for me, one of the big things, just because this code says that you can do multi-dwelling on a 12-metre frontage block, doesn't necessarily mean that it's possible. Now, I'm not even fully convinced that many sites that are 12 metres wide will actually work, because there's a whole lot of things that you need to take into account. You still need to follow council's controls when it comes to driveway widths, to landscape. A lot of councils have a landscape width along the side of the boundary where the driveway is. A lot of councils, they've got the side setbacks, you've got front setbacks, you've got rear setbacks, you've got building envelopes in some councils. You've got to meet your solar access requirements. There's a whole lot of requirements that need to be met for these 3 or more dwellings that may actually mean that some of those narrower blocks may not be possible. Just because you can do it doesn't mean it's possible. I believe that some of these narrower blocks could actually mean they're more suited. For example, a 12-metre wide block might be more suited, for example, to a dual occupancy, not necessarily a multi-dwelling. Even if it's a very long block, you've still got to show how you can execute the rest of that development. Because, see, you need to know this, that councils, not every council is on board with this new policy that's come into effect. In fact, I'm led to believe that quite a few councils push back heavily on it, hence why it's taken so long for this reform to come into effect. But you've got to remember that there's a lot of councils where this type of development has not been possible in the past. So there will be some pushback. There will be some really tight assessment of these projects and developments. So it's important when preparing and executing these type of projects and developments to make sure that you're giving yourself the best possible opportunity for an approval when you go to council. So for me, some sites may be more suited, for example, towards a dual occupancy, or 212, or you may be better to amalgamate 2 12-metre wide blocks, for example. It may not work to have a 12-metre wide block where you're doing multi-dwelling. The reason being, by the time you've got your driveway, you've got your landscape width, you've got your dwelling, then you've got to show that how do you get solar access to that property? You've got to show that how you're not going to have an adverse impact on the solar access of your neighbours. Are you going to impact their solar access? Are you going to overshadow their private open spaces, their living areas? How are you going to navigate that? When you're dealing with a narrow block, you don't often have the option of creating larger setbacks or within the footprint to make that work. And all of a sudden, the lack of yield to be able to make sure that you do comply with the solar access and not overshadow the neighbour next door. All of a sudden, you thought you could get 3 on it, but it's more likely you get 2. So you may be better off going down the duplex path rather than, for example, a detached dual lock or 3 townhouses where you're going to be up against not only neighbours pushing back on the controls, because there are some neighbours that have lived in some of these established areas for a long, long time and who have the time, they've got the money, they've got the ability to push back, they've got the ability to fight, especially if there are contentious elements that they have reasonable grounds to argue. If there is a non-compliance with council's development control plan, you can run into time, you can run into money, additional expenses on fighting those avenues. So for me, it all comes down to execution at an acquisition level, making sure that you're thinking these things through and looking at these elements prior to the acquisition of a site. So, look, on those narrower blocks, you need to factor in, is there suitable access for vehicular access for a driveway? You still need to meet council's compliance. Some councils want a double width driveway for the first 6 metres, for example, over the property so that two vehicles can pass one another, because you'll still need to make sure that vehicles can enter and exit in a forward motion, which most councils want on a multi-dwelling development these days. So on a narrower block, how are you going to demonstrate that you can manoeuvre those particular vehicles? Because you'll need to still comply with the Australian standards, and some councils have their own standards in terms of manoeuvring, but you need to make sure that you can demonstrate that you can comply with council's DCP, that you can comply with the Australian standards for manoeuvring vehicles. And on very narrow blocks, for example, a 12-metre wide block, how will you demonstrate that? How will you demonstrate that you can manoeuvre a vehicle into a garage, enter a garage and manoeuvre into a garage in that minimum 3-point turn, or and be able to manoeuvre out, come back out in a forward motion, and make sure that you're designing around those elements. Landscape. Again, just like the dual lock, the landscape, you still need to comply with council's development control plan when it comes to landscaping. Some councils have quite high constraints, some 30%, 35%, 25%. Some have quite a lot of deep soil planting and deep soil zones that you'll still need to follow and comply with council's controls around that. Some councils, you need to have a 0.5 metre strip of landscape on the boundary side of the driveway, for example. Some councils require you to have 1 metre. Some councils don't even like a straight gun barrel driveway. You may have to have be a little bit creative in how you do your driveway, just like you would have in the past normally had to carry out that element. There's still a lot of elements of the development control plan that you're going to need to follow in terms of executing an application that council will not be able to push back on. Because just because you meet those 5 or 6 SEP requirements under this new low-rise reform, if there's a whole bunch of areas where you're having to apply for variations to the DCP, and if there's a whole bunch of areas you do not meet the criteria, you need to justify to council why this should be permissible on the site. And if you can't justify that adequately, essentially what you're saying to council is it's not deemed, maybe it's an overdevelopment of the site, or maybe it's a poor use of the site, or maybe it's a poor design in terms of utilising the site the best way possible. So that's where you still need to be switched on in the acquisition stage to make sure that it is possible and permissible. Just because you can do a multi-dwelling on a 600-metre, 12-metre frontage doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be possible in that particular council. So there's just for me, that's very key. And then you've got, for example, some councils, 70% of the sites, 70% of the dwellings have to get adequate solar access. Generally, your 3 hours solar access to your private open space, your principal private open space, and your living area. That's a big one. Some councils require 100% of the dwellings, some a little bit less or a little bit more. Some councils will require a dwelling to be accessible. Some require a dwelling to be adaptable. So you still need to meet the requirements, council's development control plan requirements under that element of what council's requiring. So solar access, not every site's going to be suitable. Some sites you won't be able to meet the solar access, or you may be creating privacy issues, putting your private open space in areas that are going to cause privacy issues and impacts on the other developments. Some of the narrower sites, you may have some serious overshadowing issues from neighbours, so you can't achieve suitable solar access. So you need to factor those things in on narrower blocks as well. So obviously you've got to look at native trees. Just because a block might be 15 metres wide, it could be quite long, might be 700 or 800 square metres long. You may be able to fit 3, you may be able to fit 3 or 4 townhouses on there. you still need to factor in, just like you would normally would with a development site, what's on the site. Is it suitable for drainage in terms of stormwater? Is there alternate stormwater methods if it is backward sloping? If it's not, well, you'll need to negotiate an easement. You need to look at things like, what trees you're dealing with on the site. Is there native trees? What's the health of those trees like? And if it's unlikely that a couple of those trees will be able to go, well, you need to determine your yield. What's the tree protection zones going to be of those trees? How close can you build to those trees? Really making sure you're clear on your numbers, clear on things stacking up. Just because there's 120,000 new sites come open and available in these well-located areas, it's not to say that a whole lot of those sites could have constraints on them in terms of native trees that can impact the development potential of that site, that could take it from a 3 townhouse site all of a sudden to a dual lock site, some even not a dual lock site. So I think it's important to be on top of that, to really know what you're dealing with in that space, to have an arsenal and a toolkit of a lot of the constraints and elements that you need to look towards. So, things like side setbacks, building envelopes, you still need to meet council's requirements in those areas. Some councils have quite a significant side setback for the first floor, for example. So all of a sudden, those narrower sites can really play havoc, especially when you need to factor in your private open space. Some councils require a certain amount of square metres for private open space. Some councils have certain dimensions, often a 5x4 or 4x4 or a 6x4 principal private open space that's required to have solar access. Some of them can't be facing, like some of them have to be a certain distance, like a metre or 1.2 metres off side boundary. So all of a sudden that changes a lot of your controls on the narrower blocks. So it's important to really be on top of that, to get a good idea of what isn't permissible and possible on those sites. So don't just look at a 12-metre wide block and just think, oh, beauty, we can do 3 townhouses on this now. It's I think a lot of those smaller sites, it will be very tricky to fit, for example, 3 townhouses on those very narrow sites. But the exciting thing is there is a lot of sites and a lot of councils that have not allowed multi-dwelling, so all of a sudden you can. There's a lot of councils that might have required 18, 20 metres. All of a sudden, a lot of blocks that are 15 metres wide, you can make we've done townhouses all across different parts of New South Wales that allow multi-dwelling on narrower blocks, where we've done 14 and 15 metre blocks and multi-dwelling developments. So the exciting thing is now a lot of those areas where you've had to have 18 metres, 20 metres, 25 metres even. The exciting thing is now a lot of these, your typical 15.24 metre, your 50-foot, the old traditional 50-foot block, which was one of the most common blocks and still is one of the most common blocks you'll see in the old system, the old 50-foot wide block. All of a sudden, a lot of those old 50-foot wide blocks that are in well-located areas, close to train stations, close to local centres, now are opening up for the opportunity to possibly get you 3, some even your 4 townhouse type scenarios on, where you can really get a site that might have been good just for a dual lock in the past, or even just a house in some areas. All of a sudden you can get 3 to 4 townhouses on it, which is a terrific opportunity to get yield on a site and really generate some wealth through doing these type of developments. So I think the early adopters who jump on that, especially those type sites, the 50-footers, I think will do quite well, provided that everything stacks up, that it drains the appropriate way for stormwater, that it's not littered with native trees, that you've got good site access, taking into account good orientation. I tend to like sites that the front or the back sort of faces east-west. The reason being, in an ideal world, I like to get the driveway on the southern side, and then I like to try and get the dwellings on the northern side, like a row of townhouses on that northern side, so that you can get really good sort of winter sun and northern sun into the private open spaces, into the side of that dwelling. Also, then your overshadowing is going more onto your driveway, so you're not causing overshadowing issues with your neighbour, But the key thing, obviously, there is with that scenario too, is to look at your neighbour, look at what's next door too. The good thing is for the early adopters, next door is probably going just to be maybe just your typical suburban house, which is the most ideal scenario. So it's not you just want to make sure that that house or that whatever's next door, obviously they're going to overshadow if you've got your dwellings along the north, their dwelling, especially if it's close, right up, hard up, 900 off the boundary, for example, they may cause some overshadowing concerns. So you need to obviously factor that in. But I think that's a really good scenario that you can begin to look towards is how can I find these sites that are orientated in a terrific way. But I just think big opportunity is going to be a lot of those 50-foot sites, those 15.24 metre sites, because I know there's a lot of them. There's heaps of those sites around, and generally with good design, it's not a hard and fast everywhere, but generally with good design, get the right site, the right properties next door, limit the constraints. There's going to be some really exciting opportunities to get your 3s and 4s on your typical suburban type block in a lot of those areas. And I think the early adopters will do terrific in that space. So look, what I'll be doing in the show notes, there'll be some links. We've developed a really good article that you'll be able to access. It'll have a checklist just to help you as you're identifying those sites, just to give you some tools and some tips as you are navigating this, the new low to mid-rise reform that's come into effect. But, you know, our encouragement is to take advantage of this new opportunity, to look at these sites, to take a look at the mapping to discover where these sites are. Look at it through the lens of all the elements we've spoken about in this episode. Go back and listen to this episode again. Go back and listen to it and get yourself a bit of a toolkit, a bit of an arsenal of knowledge, so that when you're assessing a site, you're not coming up with a site that's littered with constraints or concerns or things that are going to limit the opportunities. Because what I believe you want to do when you submit that application to council, when you work with your team, your designers, your planners, when you're piecing together that application, I truly believe it needs to be airtight. It needs to be something that's well executed, well designed, something that really meets, most of council's development controls, and the ones that don't, that they're well justified, that there's a reasonable justification. But even then, I tell people, have a backup plan. Just because you want to go in for a justification in terms of maybe a landscape justification or possibly an overshadowing justification, you don't just want to hard and fast go in with that. You want to have a backup plan if council doesn't come to the party on that justification, on that variation that you are submitting, that should they not want to come to the party, what is the backup plan and what does that backup plan mean? Does it mean a loss of yield? Ideally, no. Or does it just mean a slight redesign, which could just affect the amenity, might have a little bit of an impact on the resale? But make sure you run your numbers, make sure you look at all of those factors so that you really go in with your eyes wide open. But for me, I think it's a time to be positive. It's a time to have your eyes wide open. It's an exciting time for those people who want to be an early adopter. Just make sure that you understand that this process is a DA process. Understand that we're dealing with a lot of councils that have struggled with their workload to date as it is. I believe these new reforms are now going to mean that there'll be a whole lot of more applications that councils will be dealing with. Some will handle it well, some not so well. So in terms of your timeframes, make sure that you're factoring in contingency time for approval. If that particular council's got a reputation with their 3 and 4 townhouse developments to take 12 months, allow 15 months, allow 18 months even if you want to be extra conservative in that approval process to make sure that you're not left unstuck. Factor in more of your holding costs, interest, all that side of thing if you're holding a property on finance. Make sure that you're really thinking long and hard about going in with your eyes wide open, because I truly believe one of the challenges we will face, and that's not to be negative, it's just me preempting what I believe will happen, is that we're going to see a bit of a bottleneck in some councils because councils have struggled to deal when we went through that boom a couple of years ago, we saw that a lot of councils struggled and still haven't recovered. We've seen a lot of councils running on skeleton staff. It's hard for them to get planners. It's hard for them to keep planners. So as a result, now we're seeing a bit of a bottleneck. I believe that some councils, there'll be a further bottleneck. There'll be some councils where, especially where you've not been able to do any of this type of development in the past, areas like Northern Beaches, I think, is a prime example. There's a whole lot of areas of the Northern Beaches now where you haven't been able to do dual locks. You haven't been able to do multi-dwelling. All of a sudden, that's opened up. We're going to see, I think, some bottlenecks. We're going to see some delays, and that's where, for me, it's important when you're negotiating on a site, when you're executing a deal. If you need a long runway, if you can't afford those holding costs over a larger or longer period of time, it might be a smart or wise idea, especially if you're new to this space, or you don't have the backing, or you don't have the return on investment. If you're running a very lean margin on development scheme, make sure that you really negotiate good terms. A lot of deals I've done, and even clients have done, often we've been able to get good long settlements, sometimes 12 months, even for bigger sites, even longer. It's trickier to get longer settlements, obviously, for smaller sites, but it doesn't hurt to ask the question and just work backwards from there. And, if you're able to get the 12-month settlement, great. Then you might only have to factor in a bit of additional time for potential delays in council, because I truly think there will be some councils that will push back. Again, that's not to be negative. It's just preempting what I think will happen. And I think some councils, although may be proactive and positive for this new reform, I think will potentially struggle with the workload, and as a result, we will see some delays. So the best investors, the best developers always preempt it, always have contingency of finance, but contingency of time as well. So look, for me, there's so much more we can unpack in this. I hope this has been super helpful. I hope this has given you a little bit more confidence around the reforms in regards to multi-dwelling development. And look, if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out through any of our social channels. And look, make sure if you've enjoyed this episode, share it with people around you, share it with anyone you know who is interested in doing multi-residential developments, especially under this new reform. Make sure you like and subscribe if you haven't yet done so. And I've really enjoyed walking you through this process, and we'll see you next week.